Cinderella and Aladdin. Read and colour fun. Cinderella. There was once a wealthy nobleman whose wife died, leaving him with a baby daughter. The baby grew to be a charming little girl, pretty and good. In time, her father married again. The stepmother had 2 daughters of her own, who were selfish, lazy, greedy girls. One was very vain and spent her time looking in the mirror. The other was very greedy, always eating and feeding her little dog with chocolates. They were very jealous of their new little sister, because she was gentle and kind. They drove her into the kitchen and set her to do all the roughest work of the house. She had to scrub and polish floors, clean the great staircase and do all the washing up. Her sisters did nothing to help her but spent their time trying to enjoy themselves. They laughed at her, gave her only rags to wear and called her Cinderella. One day there was great excitement. An invitation came from the king's palace for the nobleman and his daughters to attend a grand ball to celebrate the prince's 21st birthday. The 2 ugly sisters were delighted. "I shall be beautifully dressed and more important than anyone there," said one. "Oh," said the other, "I can only think of all the lovely cakes and sweetmeats we shall have. How delicious!" "How I would love to see it all," sighed Cinderella. The sisters laughed loudly. "You?" they said. "Cinder girls from the kitchen do not go to the palace." "But you may help us to prepare our dresses." Poor Cinderella worked very hard, sewing big red roses onto one sister's dress and stitching pearls and ribbons into a pattern for the other. But she sang happily as she stitched, to cheer herself up, for she had nothing to wear but the plain brown dress that she always had to wear for her work in the kitchen. The 2 sisters were very proud of their long hair, and Cinderella had to spend long hours arranging it in different ways until she found a style that suited them. Then she helped them to dress in their silken gowns, and at last even they were satisfied. "We are so beautiful that the prince will only see us," they said. Haughtily, they went out to their coach, thinking their splendid clothes would dazzle everyone. They did not remember to wave goodbye to poor little Cinderella, who had done so much to help them. She watched them drive away and then went into her dark, empty kitchen and sat by the cold hearth with her toes in the ashes. "How I should love to go to the ball," sighed Cinderella. Tears trickled down her cheeks and made a pool beside her feet. Suddenly there was a loud swishy noise like the wings of a huge bird. Cinderella looked up with startled eyes and saw a lady with a large cape and a high-crowned hat. "I am your fairy godmother," said the lady, "and you shall go to the ball." Cinderella looked up in astonishment. "Oh, may I really go, godmother?" "Yes, but hurry, child, we have a lot to do," said her kind godmother. "Go and get a mousetrap and put it outside the garden gate." Cinderella hurried to the barn and found a trap with 4 mice in it, then wonderingly placed it as she was bid. "And now," said her godmother, "go into the garden and find the largest pumpkin you can and put it with the mousetrap." Still more puzzled, Cinders found a large, round, golden pumpkin. Then her godmother waved her wand, and in a magic moment the pumpkin changed into a golden coach. The 4 mice were changed into fine, white, prancing horses. Cinderella was dazzled with all this splendour, but still more magic was to come. Another wave of the wand, and a rat, who had peeped around the kitchen door, was changed into a jovial coachman in a splendid red coat trimmed with gold braid. "Now we must have the little lizards that live near the warm stones in the garden," said the godmother. Quickly the lizards were changed into 4 slender footmen in pale blue dress and white powdered wigs. "Now one last thing," said the fairy godmother, smiling. "A pretty dress for you." She took a cobweb from the corner in the kitchen and a handful of moonbeams and stardust that flowed through the window, and quickly she wove a wonderful gown as light as a feather that gleamed and shone with the brightness of the rainbow. In a trice Cinderella's rags were gone and she was wearing a fairy dress, her hair arranged with gleaming jewels, and on her little feet she had the daintiest pair of shining glass slippers. "Now all is ready," said her godmother. "But remember, When the clock strikes 12, you must leave the ball. If you do not, the horses will change back to mice, the footman to lizards, the coachman to a rat, and the coach to a pumpkin, and you will once more be a Cinder girl in rags. Be sure that you do not forget." Cinderella promised that she would not forget her kind godmother's instructions, and thanked her for all the wonderful things she had done. Cinderella stepped into the coach and was whirled away to the palace. When she arrived, everyone bowed to the beautiful unknown princess, who seemed to be gowned in starlight. As soon as the prince saw her, he came across the ballroom to take her hand, nor did he dance with any other for the rest of the evening. The ugly sisters said to each other, "We would be as beautiful if we had such a lovely dress." Cinderella was so happy and danced so lightly, the prince so charming, the music so gay, that the time went swiftly as a dream. Everyone smiled to see the young people so happy. Then, in a pause in the music, Cinderella heard the great palace clock strike the tone for 11:30. With a little cry of fear, she turned away and fled from the ballroom. Swiftly she ran down the great palace staircase, through the palace gardens, and was safely in her coach on her way home before the clock could strike 12. Just as she reached the door and stepped from the coach, everything changed back as it was before. Cinderella was in her old rag dress. The mice, the rat and the lizard scampered away, and the pumpkin was left in the middle of the courtyard. Later, her sisters returned home in very bad tempers. The next morning the two sisters were in a little better mood, and told Cinderella of the strange princess with whom the prince had danced all evening. "You must improve our dresses," said the eldest sister. The prince was very sad at the loss of the princess, and decided that another ball must be held, in the hope that she might return. So later that day a messenger arrived with another invitation to the palace ball. They were delighted. Now Cinderella had a very difficult time with her sisters. They wanted dresses like that of the strange princess. She had to try many different patterns, the materials and decorations, in helping to make new dresses for her elder sisters. But she was very patient and did her best to make their costumes as lovely as possible. All the time she was hoping that her kind fairy godmother would help her to go once more to the palace to see her prince. How hard they all worked to make the sisters look beautiful. Cinderella brought them powders and perfumes, arranged their hair with flowers and ribbons over and over again. They painted and powdered and admired themselves from every angle in the large mirror. They tried on dozens of pairs of slippers of every colour. At last they were satisfied and ready to set out for the palace, quite forgetting to thank or say goodbye to Cinderella. As soon as her sisters had gone, Cinderella went out into the courtyard, wistfully hoping that her fairy godmother would return. Almost at once there was a rush of wind in the trees, and she was standing beside her. How happily Cinderella greeted her! In the blink of an eye, Cinderella was sitting again in the splendid coach, in a dress more beautiful than the last, driving to the palace. The prince welcomed her with delight, and she could think of nothing but his smiles. They danced together, and she was so sweet that all the ladies smiled and admired her beautiful dress. The ugly sisters were pleased when she spoke to them and introduced them to the prince. "She is quite pretty," said the eldest, "and her dress is almost as fine as ours." Cinderella and the prince smiled to each other when they overheard the sisters' words, and whirled into another dance. "Surely she will not disappear again," thought the prince. Cinderella was so happy that the time flew past. The lights, the flowers, the music, the flowing dances caused her to forget time until, as she stood for a brief moment on the palace balcony, the clock began to strike 12. Poor Cinderella thought she heard a little voice saying, "When the clock strikes 12, the horses will change back to mice. The lizards will—" In a great fright she ran swiftly down the staircase. Quickly the prince followed, but Cinderella had disappeared. Sadly he returned. Then suddenly a bright sparkle caught his eye, and he picked up a tiny glass slipper which Cinderella had lost in her hurried fright. The coach had disappeared, and only the pumpkin remained to show where it had been. Cinders, now clad in her old rags, ran down the lanes towards her home, and at last, cold and tired, reached her kitchen door, just as the first light was showing and the owls were returning home. "Shall I ever see the prince again?" she wondered wearily, as she sank down on a stool by the dead fire. But the prince was determined to find the beautiful lady who had won his heart, and vowed he would wed no other. So taking the tiny glass slipper, he set out with his heralds to find her. For days they searched in the towns and villages. At each one a herald proclaimed that the prince would wed the lady who could wear the glass slipper. All the ladies were eager to try on the slipper, but no foot was small enough to fit it. When the prince came to the village where Cinderella lived, her two sisters were very excited. "One of us must be able to wear that slipper," said the eldest. She pulled and pulled, then scolded the page who held the cushion. But try as she would, she could not get her foot into that tiny slipper. "You must try," she said at last to the other ugly sister. The second sister took her place and tried to force the slipper onto her broad, plump foot, but it was no use. Try as hard as she could. "Cinderella, come quickly and help me get my foot into this silly slipper," she cried angrily. "You are stronger than I am." Cinderella knew that it could not be done, but she came shyly out of the kitchen into the courtyard. "This lady must also try to wear the slipper," said the herald. How the ugly sisters laughed. "A cinder girl in those rags," they said. "How silly! What a waste of time!" But the herald insisted, and when Cinderella tried, her foot slipped easily and snugly into the glass slipper. Then she took the matching one from her pocket and put it on. At once her rags changed into a beautiful dress. Now everyone knew her for the unknown princess. The prince was overjoyed to have found his beautiful princess at last. The heralds blew their long brass trumpets, and all the people cheered their future queen. The ugly sisters were very afraid of what might happen to them, for now Cinderella would be the greatest lady in the land. But Cinderella was very kind to them and forgave them for all the unkind things they had done. In a few days' time a great celebration was proclaimed. Cinderella was married to her prince, to the cheers and joys of all the people. The wedding feast lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. Even the ugly sisters were happy, and they behaved much better in the days that followed. As for Cinderella and the prince, they lived happily ever after.